Okay, for the final talk of the day, my name is Jorge Luis. I'm going to talk a bit about how, specifically my team, or how we think of open source in trivago, and basically how we do open source at the workplace without being paid to do open source in a way. Um, I'm also a member of the Apache Software Foundation, and I like search and metrics, which is exactly what I work at. So we work on the monitoring performance team along with Matthias. And let's start by saying that trivago runs around 55 platforms worldwide. We have a backend response time of around 300 milliseconds, and we ingest around 5 terabytes of logs per day. This kind of platform, you think about it, and the tools that we use to build it, surprise, is mostly open source, as at least 90 something percent. I'm not sure on the statistic, but we use open source heavily. The funny thing is that everything from the language that we use to the tools that we use to monitor this infrastructure to the orchestrators that we use is open source. So we are heavily users of open source in general. It's safe to say by now, I will say, that building such a huge infrastructure without open source is, if not impossible, it will be nearly impossible, considering that even the internet is built on top of open source, like literally the routers and everything. If we think about it, the way that I approach this, or that we approach this in trivago, is with the Boy Scout rule. How many people are familiar with this rule? Okay, good. From the camping background, this is something like leave the campground cleaner than you found it. Robin C. Martin applied this to the software word in the way that always leave the code you are editing a little better than you found it. And it's kind of the philosophy behind clean code. A bit more general is about leaving everything better than you found them, or that you found it. And the way that we do that, or the way that we pick that up, is by applying certain tips that we pick along the way. So trivago at its core is we are a tech company, but not a software company. What do I mean by this? We build software and we deliver something that provides value to the user, but the software that we build by itself is not what generates profit for us. It's not what generates value for us as a company. And yet we contribute to open source. So tech and software in this case are not exactly the same thing. Let's talk about some of the tips that we pick up. So the way that we approach this is that we are working with a project and we find some project that we want to use, that we want to apply on one of the problems that we have to solve. And that project almost solves what we need except for certain parts. We try to avoid forking that project and for our internal. It can be very tempting to just fork the project, add the feature that we want, host it into our internal Git repository or whatever you're using, and be done with that. We solve the problem. We are using it, we are happy. In reality, we try to contribute that back upstream as long as possible, and as long as it doesn't conflict with the features of the general project. That also means that it's needed to keep an eye on what we want to contribute back. If it's something that is really, really specific to trivago, that no one else could be remotely interested on that, it may not make sense to contribute back upstream. And the last tip in the sense is like always communicate with the maintainers, and as always try to be polite and try to think that whatever we are contributing back is also something that they will need to take care. If we are sharing a new project for scratch, like was the case with Golem, for instance, which is a multiplexer log solution that was developed internally on trivago, it's important to keep in mind that you need to develop from the very beginning, you want to develop such a system in a way that is not very coupled with the rest of the ecosystem in trivago. Because on the long run, it will be even more difficult to split that project from its dependencies and publish that. And that applies to everything. It could be to a project, to a NPM library, to a Webpack plugin, etc. It's also important to choose the right license. And this is a topic that we could probably have an entire conference around, but basically boils down to how do you want the users to use that code. Build, if it's possible, a community around the project in the way that if you are contributing something big, like the next Kafka, how many people is familiar with Kafka? Okay, a lot of people. So the story of Kafka is that it was developed on linked in, and then it was contributed to Apache Software Foundation. This didn't happen by accident. The core of this is that they wanted more people involved, and they didn't want to be the ones controlling the project. And that's why it's very, very important to choose a governance model. In this case, the Shameful plugin, the Apache Software Foundation can help you. But it's a way of guaranteeing that there is no one single entity behind a project that is controlling its resources. So you are not the omnipotent leader behind that. And finally, our last tip, in a way, is that not all contributions have to be complicated, really. This is a pull request that came out of our project not that long ago. And the thing that we changed, this is a pull request to Grafana. How many people know Grafana? So we are heavily users of Grafana. And this pull request, the only thing that it changed was that chevron that you see there, that on some part they were using like a greater than character on the font that they were using. And that kind of break the UI of the system. And this entire pull request took 5 minutes to find where that was defined, to do the change, tested locally, took longer to build than to test, but yeah. And then a couple of additional minutes to sign the CLA and create the pull request. This is not a huge change. It's not something that is going to be groundbreaking for Grafana, and yet we are making the software a tiny bit better for the other users. So not all contributions need to be like a super complex improvement. It could be something very simple. Evaluating success is kind of complicated, so what I want to say here is basically take a look at our open source page, if you haven't done already, and to our GitHub page for Trivago, and this is like some of the projects that we contribute to, or that we kind of hosted. I don't know, Gollum, Parallel Webpack, Melody, Amara, Logstash Code, Prados. These are some of the projects. We have ton of more of this in our repository. So you can take a look, and basically if there is something that you would like to improve or something that you like to make better for the rest of your fellow users, is encouraged. Thank you.
Thank you.